On a gloomy night in the quiet town of Blackwood, thick fog crept through the deserted streets. The city, known for its peacefulness, was about to be shaken by a macabre crime that would leave a permanent scar on its inhabitants. Emily, a lovely and beloved young woman, has mysteriously disappeared. Desperation set in when news of her disappearance spread, and volunteers began searching far and wide for her. It was in the nearby woods that the nightmare came true. Emily's body was discovered, mutilated so horribly that even the local sheriff, John, a veteran of many years, was horrified. The crime shocked the community, spreading fear and distrust. Residents who previously left their doors unlocked now locked them in fear of the killer who was on the loose in their quiet town. The investigation began, but clues were scarce and answers elusive. Blackwood was on the brink of a nightmare that none of its inhabitants would ever forget. After the discovery of Emily's mutilated body, the town of Blackwood went into shock. The news of the macabre crime spread like wildfire, leaving all residents stunned and apprehensive. Emily was a young woman adored by everyone, known for her joy and kindness. Her disappearance and the horrific manner in which her body was found shocked the community in profound and unimaginable ways. Sheriff John, an experienced and respected man in town, took on the case. He was determined to find whoever was responsible for such horror and restore the sense of security that Blackwood had lost. However, the crime seemed shrouded in mystery. The few clues were confusing, and each dead end led to more questions than answers. As John investigated, the atmosphere in the town became increasingly tense, with residents living in fear of the unknown that lurked in Blackwood's shadows. As John's investigation progressed, the climate of distrust in Blackwood became even more oppressive. The small town was at the mercy of an insidious fear that was spreading like a plague. John began scouring city records for any information that could shed light on the macabre crime. It was then that he discovered a disturbing detail. Similar murder cases had occurred in the region years ago. The dusty archives revealed a dark past that had been forgotten by time. The sheriff began to wonder if Blackwood was dealing with a serial killer, someone who had eluded authorities for years. Paranoia in the city reached its peak when news of these old cases spread. Residents looked at each other suspiciously, questioning who could be responsible for the recent crimes. The night in Blackwood became increasingly sinister, and the shadow of the serial killer loomed over the community, leaving everyone terrified. As Sheriff John deepened his investigation into the macabre crime in Blackwood, he began to uncover disturbing details. Similar cases of murder had occurred in the region years ago, but these events had been forgotten by time. Dusty records in the city's archives revealed a dark past that now seemed to be resurfacing. John wondered if he was dealing with a serial killer who had evaded authorities for years, once again unleashing his terror on the community. The news of the old cases further shook the city, fueling the climate of paranoia that had already established itself. Residents began to look at each other with suspicion. The nights in Blackwood became even more eerie, with the streets empty and silent except for the whispering wind that seemed to carry the town's dark secrets. As John deepened his investigation, the serial killer's shadow loomed large over the community, leaving everyone terrified and afraid of what the future held. The climate of terror and distrust deepened in Blackwood as residents locked themselves in their homes overnight. The ominous fog that now seemed to envelop the city only contributed to the nightmarish atmosphere that had set in. Sheriff John, determined to uncover the truth behind the macabre crimes, intensified his efforts. He began questioning the villagers, looking for any clue that could lead to the serial killer's identity. Families were on high alert, and parents kept their children under constant surveillance. Fear prevented people from trusting each other, and the community fragmented as each became suspicious of the other. Meanwhile, the city remained plunged into darkness, the lights of the houses flickering in the fog. Blackwood's secrets were about to be revealed, and the serial killer continued to lurk in the shadows, awaiting his next moment of horror. As Sheriff John continued his frantic search for clues that would lead to the serial killer's identity, the residents of Blackwood lived in constant fear and distrust. The city was shrouded in constant fog, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. Rumors and theories about the killer spread like wildfire. Every glance exchanged on the streets turned suspicious, and even the closest friends began to doubt each other. The nights in the city were the worst. The houses were locked with caution. Any sound in the middle of the night was cause for panic, and paranoia grew with each passing day. John, however, was not willing to give up. He knew he was close to uncovering the truth behind the macabre crimes that had terrorized Blackwood. But the shadow of the serial killer was always present, lurking in the shadows of the fog, ready to strike again and plunge the city into a new nightmare. Sheriff John was increasingly determined to solve the mystery of the macabre crimes in Blackwood. He deepened his investigation, interviewing residents and scouring city records for clues. Meanwhile, the climate of distrust and fear in the city reached its peak. Residents eyed each other with suspicion, avoiding interactions and staying locked in their homes at night. The once welcoming streets of Blackwood were now deserted and silent. The hooded figure, which had been seen several times near the crime scenes, continued to haunt the city's nightmares. The ominous fog seemed to obscure their movements, making it impossible to identify the suspect. The nights were the scariest. The whispering wind seemed to carry dark secrets, and any unfamiliar sound was cause for panic. Blackwood was trapped in terror, and the serial killer, still hidden in the shadows, awaited his next victim with devilish patience. As the search for the serial killer in Blackwood continued, the ominous fog enveloping the town seemed to intensify, making the nights even more oppressive. Fear and distrust had transformed the peaceful community into an unrecognizable place. Sheriff John scoured city records for any connection between the victims, looking for clues that could lead him to the killer. Each clue brought him a little closer to the truth, but the mystery continued to deepen. Families in Blackwood lived in a state of constant alert, locking their doors and windows at night. Every sound in the darkness was cause for apprehension, and residents lived in fear of what might happen next. The hooded figure, who was now frequently seen hanging around crime scenes, remained an enigma. The fog obscured their movements, making it impossible to identify the suspect. The city was on the brink of collapse as the serial killer, still hidden in the shadows, awaited his next opportunity to spread terror and death. Sheriff John was determined to uncover the truth behind the terrible crimes plaguing Blackwood. Each clue took him deeper into the city's maze of secrets and fears. Meanwhile, the atmosphere of distrust and paranoia in Blackwood has reached unprecedented levels. Residents increasingly isolated themselves, avoiding interactions and staying locked in their homes at night. The deserted and silent streets were now dominated by thick fog. John delved deeper into the investigation, thoroughly questioning residents and examining old records. He began to notice a strange connection between the victims, something that seemed to be the common thread behind the macabre crimes. The nights in Blackwood continued to be the most terrifying. The whispering wind seemed to carry the city's dark secrets, and any unfamiliar sound was cause for panic. The hooded figure, which had been seen again near the crime scenes, became a constant nightmare in the minds of residents. The serial killer remained hidden in the shadows, awaiting his next opportunity to spread terror. Sheriff John was closer to solving the mystery of the macabre crimes in Blackwood than ever before. He had discovered a dark connection between the victims, an enigma that brought him closer to the truth. However, the city was on the verge of collapse. The climate of fear and paranoia had deepened, and residents lived in a state of constant apprehension. The nights were especially spooky, with the streets empty and fog engulfing the city. John continued to interrogate residents, scour records, and follow leads. He was determined to end the series of murders that had terrorized Blackwood for so long. The hooded figure, now a constant presence in the city's nightmares, remained elusive and mysterious. The serial killer, still hidden in the shadows, patiently awaited his next opportunity to strike terror again. As John's investigation nears its conclusion, the city stands on a precipice, with darkness and evil threatening to consume it completely. Sheriff John's investigation was about to reach its climax. He had put the pieces of the puzzle together and now had a clearer understanding of the connections between the victims. Yet the serial killer remained elusive, like a fleeting shadow in the town of Blackwood. The tension in the city had reached its peak. Residents lived in a state of constant fear and distrust. The nights were the most terrifying, with thick fog hiding any movement in the empty streets. John was determined to end the series of murders that had plagued the city. he followed a final clue that led him to an old abandoned building on the outskirts of Blackwood. As he entered the gloomy building, a sense of apprehension enveloped him. Inside, he made a chilling discovery. The walls were covered with photographs of the victims and lit candles, creating a macabre sanctuary. The serial killer, however, was not far away. He appeared before John, revealing his face and his disturbing motivation. The sheriff was face to face with the killer, but the truth was darker than he had ever imagined. The city of Blackwood was about to learn the horrors that had been hidden in the shadows for so long. Inside the abandoned building, Sheriff John found himself facing the serial killer. The hooded figure, now revealing his face, was someone John would never have imagined. He was a Blackwood resident, someone he had known for years. The killer, whose eyes glittered with sick obsession, confessed to his crimes with chilling coldness. He believed that the murders were a kind of dark ritual designed to purify the city of its hidden sins. The killer's revelations hit John like a punch in the gut. The city he knew and swore to protect had its own scars and disturbing secrets. While the killer justified his actions with macabre motivations, John knew his mission was to put an end to the carnage. He faced the killer with courage, determined to put an end to the tide of terror that had swept Blackwood. But the killer, with a sinister smile on his lips, was willing to fight to the end, throwing the city into a final confrontation between light and darkness. The confrontation between Sheriff John and the serial killer reached its climax inside the abandoned building, where the macabre truth had been revealed. The killer's words echoed in the dark space as he justified his actions as a purification mission. John, struggling with revulsion and the shock of the disturbing revelations, knew he was Blackwood's last hope. He could not allow the killer to continue sowing terror in the city. The confrontation began, a desperate battle between good and evil. The killer, motivated by a distorted belief, revealed terrifying cruelty, challenging John's resolve. The walls of the abandoned building witnessed the epic fight as John fought to subdue the killer and bring him to justice. Shadows danced around them, witnessing the clash between light and dark that would determine Blackwood's fate. As the fighting raged, the city anxiously awaited an outcome that would finally put an end to the nightmare that had haunted it for so long. The fierce fight between Sheriff John and the serial killer continued inside the abandoned building. Shadows danced around them, witnessing the clash between good and evil that would decide Blackwood's fate. The killer, driven by his distorted belief, revealed a frightening cruelty and disturbing determination. John, despite being injured and exhausted, knew he could not retreat. He was fighting not only for his own life, but for the safety of the entire city. With each blow exchanged, the dark truth about Blackwood's buried secrets emerged, creating a suffocating atmosphere. As the confrontation unfolded, the city waited with heavy hearts, hoping the battle between light and dark would come to a conclusion. The battle reached its climax when John finally managed to overpower the killer, putting an end to the tide of terror that had plagued Blackwood for so long. The city was free of the shadow that had enveloped it, but the scars would remain forever. The confrontation in the abandoned building has finally come to a terrible end. Sheriff John managed to subdue the serial killer, but not without sacrifice. He was injured and exhausted, but his determination to protect Blackwood was unwavering. Authorities were called, and the killer was taken into custody. The residents of Blackwood watched in silence, mixing relief and horror, as the hooded figure was removed from the scene. With the threat over, the city began the difficult healing process. The atmosphere of distrust and fear began to slowly dissipate, but the memories of the horrors that had happened would remain forever. John, now a hero in Blackwood's eyes, knew the town would need time to recover. He had faced the evil that had hidden in the shadows, and the light had finally prevailed. The small town of Blackwood rallied together in its resilience, determined to overcome the nightmare that had haunted it. She was free, but the scars of the past would serve as constant reminders of the price of courage and determination.